Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar of the AuTeach Summer Webinar Series. My name is Robin Roscigno. I'm the founder of AuTeach. And we're just making sure we're streaming live on all of the right platforms. So just bear with us as we work out the kinks on our first one. Just waiting, just giving it a second to make sure we're waiting to hear. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for bearing with us. This is our first webinar series and our first webinar within that series. So we're trying to figure out our streaming. So we appreciate everyone's patience while we get everything up and running. We're so excited to have our first speaker, Cioe Peña, who's going to speak to us all today about emergent bilinguals and special education. And I wanted to make a few announcements about AuTeach things. One, there is a webinar like this every single Wednesday this summer, starting at 8 p.m., so same time. Next week is actually yours truly. So I'll be talking about reading strategies and reading comprehension. And after that, we have a whole lineup of all of your favorite TikTokers. So it'll be really exciting for everybody. The other announcement we wanted to make is that we have now pre-registration up for a parenting course that's going to be available in the fall. There's payment plans available, and it's going to be a really great course. We've been starting to prepare it now, and it's going to be amazing, and we hope that you all can join us. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker, Maria. Hi, Maria. So Maria is very gracious and patient with our technology.
So you are patient with me, so this is a win-win.
We're in this together. So Maria Cioe Peña earned her PhD in urban education from the Graduate Center, City University of New York, where she was also an advanced research collaborative fellow and a presidential magnet fellow. She's a former elementary school teacher whose passion for children and social justice in education pushes her to fight for equity and full inclusion for children of diverse backgrounds and abilities. With a BA in English and an MS Ed in teaching urban students with disabilities, Maria's research focuses on bilingual children with dis/abilities, their families, and their ability to access multilingual learning spaces within New York City public schools. Her interests are deeply rooted in language practices and dis/ability awareness within schools and families. Maria was recently awarded first place for the 2019 Outstanding Dissertation of the Year by the National Association for Bilingual Education. Huge accomplishment, Maria. Congratulations and welcome.
Thanks. I think I sent you an old bio, but you know, it's a COVID year.
Impressive nonetheless.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I will turn things over to you and let you run your thing here.
Yeah. I just want to say first, thank you so much for having me. And I'm just so in awe of the community that you've been able to build through AuTeach. Just so impressive the way you've been using social media to really advance autonomy, right, for people with autism. And I'm just so grateful that I'm part of that work now as a guest here. So thank you for that.
We're so happy to have you. So I'm gonna turn me off and you can share your stuff, and then I'll be back for some discussion and Q&A at the end.
Sure, perfect. So I'm going to share my screen. Thanks. I'm going to share my screen. I realized about 2 hours ago that when Robin and I first talked about me being on the webinar, that she was like, you can talk about your book, which came out recently, and it's called Mother and Labeled Children. And I love that book, and it's a great project. But I've been so consumed with the topic around what is language and how do we talk about language that when it came time to actually prepare the talk, that's the place that I went to. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen for 1 second. And then start my presentation. Oopsie daisy. Okay. You'll notice that there are some subtitles at the bottom. These are automated. They're not great or perfect, but it's my effort to make sure that we can maximize inclusion even in these virtual platforms when we're working on shoestring budgets. So this presentation is called Where Does Language Reside? A conversation on language learning and expression for multilingual people with disabilities. And in my mind, I really organized this as trying to tease out the false relationship that's been developed between linguistic awareness, right? So the languages that people know and use, and society's fixation on oral expression or spoken communication as indicators of intelligence and capacity. And really looking at how does that impact students' lives. So in order to look at this, I've organized a little agenda. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about me and my work, and then we'll start talking about how do people communicate, what is bilingualism, and then what are some emerging ideas that are coming out of my research around how students with disabilities use language, whether that's oral production or nonverbal communication. And then we'll look at what does this mean for teaching and research. So a little bit about me. I'm going to go in reverse order. I'm a parent, so I have 2 young children. So my research focuses a lot on mothers, and I'm a mother myself, and I think that's just important to point out, especially because this webinar might be interrupted if my daughter wakes up because she has a fever. So I think putting my identity as a mother at the forefront of my work is really important to me. I'm a researcher, so I ask a lot of questions. In particular, I feel like my work as a researcher is really connected to my experiences as a student. So now we're going to jump to the beginning. So I was actually a classified student. I was classified within public schools as an English language learner. I immigrated to the US when I was 8 years old. Around 7, 8 years old. And I was placed in bilingual education programs and ESL programs, as one is. I was also, although I identify as neurodiverse, that designation was not given to me until I was an adult. For most of my life, I was diagnosed with multiple types of anxiety disorders. OCD and general anxiety disorders were the largest classifications I held. But I also recognize that I'm one of the lucky few who was able to make it through school without much stigmatization because my disabilities, right, they worked with school demands, right? So my OCD manifested itself in compulsive note-taking and in compulsive rewriting, as well as compulsive research, all things that from the outside look really shiny and impressive. My anxiety manifested itself as social isolation. So I buried myself in schoolwork as a way to avoid social interactions. You know, all of these things in the right eyes and on the right body look like studiousness and seriousness as a student. But all these things are also complicated by my immigrant identity, which allowed educators to take me under their wing as the nurturing of a model minority. And so I say those things because even though I share positionalities with the communities that I work with, I also recognize that the ways that labels have been applied to us and manifested in our lives have been different. And you know, in some ways, I've experienced privilege with my classifications that other people have not. Eventually, I became a teacher. I was a bilingual special education teacher for many years. I was also an early intervention teacher. And I started looking for answers. I was really struggling in the classroom in serving my students' linguistic needs and meeting their academic needs and having tensions of, you know, having an IEP and this legal mandate that told me that students were on reading levels at kindergarten, but also having to prepare them for 5th grade, English language arts test, and the tension that was creating for me resulted in questions. And I stepped away from the classroom to return to graduate school. And at some point, I landed at a place where I was interested in looking at the breakdown between home and school. And honestly, it makes perfect sense that I would end up in a career in education, since that is the place where I have been most successful. It's where individuality is rewarded. And so it was and continues to be a place where I can be my most fullest self without having to disclose, which I often only do with my graduate students as part of conversations around internalized ableism. So I share all these things because I have particular feelings and relationships with schooling and education that tend to be really different than the experiences of the communities that I'm working with. And so I try to be really aware about that in this work. And I'm also just really interested in thinking about what was it that as a child allowed me to feel so full, right? That then as a teacher allowed me to feel like my practice was really fragmented. And part of that was really rooted in language. So I, by training, I would say I would call myself an educational sociolinguist. So I study how society, language, and education come together. I'm not interested in microlinguistics or so like how certain sounds or features are used, but rather the social phenomena. So how do people use language? How is language use regulated? And how is it commodified? I'm also really interested in looking at emergent bilinguals labeled as disabled. I use that terminology in order to acknowledge that assessments and labels are really based on human assessment, right? And special education is a field that is heavily dependent on human assessment. Behaviors or actions that one educator may consider indicative of a disability, another may not. We also know that assessment is not absent of bias. Cultural, socioeconomic, and gender bias, among others, can be introduced through the assessment tool or the assessor. And so it's for this reason that I use the term labeled as disabled, to acknowledge both the ambiguity in who is deemed disabled, but also to acknowledge the reality that most children are not aware of their disability classification, and that really limits their ability to own such an identity, right? So to be really called a person with a disability. And my theoretical work is really based on this idea that I call critical disabilities radiolinguistics perspective, which is probably like the most academic-y technical part of this talk that I'll say. But it's this idea of building off of discrete and radiolinguistics perspectives, from the work of Anima Ferry Connor and the work of Flores and Rosa. And so my argument is that culturally and linguistically diverse students are not only subject to the white gaze or to the medical gaze, but more specifically to the white normative gaze. And so as such, the white normative gaze pathologizes these students not only by disability, but also by race and by linguistic practice. And I think that this is an important thing to understand because it's looking at what are the intersectional experiences of these students along the lines of how is it that emergent bilinguals with disabilities experiences are different than white students with disabilities, or emergent bilingual students who are not classified as being disabled. And it's because those things come together in particular ways for these students. Okay, so in thinking about how people communicate, I think about it in 3 ways. So the first is languaging, and languaging is the process of making meaning and shaping knowledge and experiences. This comes from Swain. And so the idea here is that language users strategically select features from their verbal and nonverbal linguistic repertoires, many of which are not exclusive to one linguistic code or another, or one named language or another. So if we think about language in this way, we can also be much more inclusive about which linguistic practices are recognized and which ones are supported, cultivated, and valued within school settings. One theory that's also really powerful in the way that I think about language and communication is translanguaging. Translanguaging theory holds that people do not possess discrete languages in their heads, rather they do language, right? And they're actively languaging, so they're actively using linguistic features to communicate meaning and to make themselves understood. And so what that would look like for an emergent bilingual is that if they were to use words or vocabularies from two separate, sets of linguistic codes, let's say English and Spanish, what someone might call Spanglish, right, or broken English or broken Spanish, translanguaging looks at that behavior and says, oh, look, that person is using all of their linguistic resources to communicate, to make meaning, to make themselves known and be heard, right? Which I think is a really powerful way of thinking about language and thinking about language mixing, or these ideas of language mixing, or even the way we think about how nonverbal language plays in communication and interaction. And then finally, when we think about nonverbal languages, the way that they're written about or discussed, right, it's essentially that nonverbal communication is abnormal, right? It is not normal. If you're a nonverbal person, particularly in schools, right, you tend to be segregated and isolated from your peers. You are designated as an ASL user, right? But we don't necessarily count ASL as someone who uses ASL as a multilingual person, right? So there are very structured ways that we think about language that are not very inclusive, right? And that are actually not really connected to how language functions. And so for me, it makes me think about, is language primarily perceived as a fluid social practice or a measurable commodity, right? And we know that in the ways that we talk about multilingualism, and we've seen people talk about multilingualism, bilingualism in particular, we can think about language use as through a capitalistic structure, and completely erase any cultural or socially significant meaning that it has to people. And when we do that, it allows us to really limit and control who has access to language use and who do we get to include in the community and in the groups. And so even within language, right? So within ideas of bilingualism, we see that there are different ways of thinking about bilingualism as well, and there's different types. So put simply, bilingualism is the ability to use two languages. However, defining bilingualism is problematic, since individuals with varying bilingual characteristics may be classified as bilingual, right? So definitions of bilingual range from a minimal proficiency in two languages to an advanced level of proficiency, which allows the speaker to function and appear as a native-like speaker for two languages. A person may describe themselves as bilingual, but may mean only the ability to converse and communicate orally. Others may be proficient in reading in two or more languages, right? So there's like so many different ways that we can define bilingualism, and all of them are not necessarily positive, right? And depending on the body that's possessing these linguistic practices, we notice the ways in which we talk about that child's bilingualism or multilingualism differently. So we've seen conversations of students being semilingual, right, or lacking language completely. And so what does it mean when we call somebody semilingual? What does it mean when we say that they lack language? And I feel like we have to recognize that a lot of that is based on people's perception of oral production, right? And so it's not about, do you understand, but what are you saying, and can I understand you? So in many ways, this is, again, focusing on the listener and taking all of the autonomy away from the speaker, right? Or the person or the communicator. Oh, gonna breathe because I've been going really fast. So, what does this mean? For me, the crux of this is that language access is tied to ableist ideology. And what I mean by this is that language access is completely related to an individual's proximity to normal, and it's not their own assessment, but their perceived proximity to normal, right? And normal in conversations that I'm thinking about is determined by disability, by race, by gender, by age, by class, right? And even though there is no normal, right, these are all arbitrary designations of normal, they serve a purpose, right? Because they're meant to decide on who has access to certain things in society. And that also includes who has access to language learning and how is that person designated, right, at the title of bilingual or multilingual. It's really about control, right? It's another form of control, and it's physical control, but also intellectual control. So where are all of these ideas coming from? They're not just like in my head, I swear. A lot of this thinking that I've been having is pretty new. I would say it's probably in the last 8 or 9 months. And that's because I conducted a study last summer where I wasn't actually looking at this particular question. I was really interested in looking at the impact that COVID-19's push to remote schooling had on multilingual families, right? And so I was specifically interested in seeing what was the impact that this educational space had on mothers, and how were they managing everything. And at one point we started having conversations about how they designated or how they identified their child. And it was actually one of the very early conversations. It was a survey that I had used, and I would say, do you consider your child bilingual, yes or no? And from there, I really started to notice that what I had thought about when I created that question was very much rooted in oral production, but what the mothers heard wasn't always rooted in that. And so that brought me to the question of, is language about input or output? Is it about meaning making or meaning getting? Is it about communication or careers, right? And so during my initial analysis stages of my research, I noticed that mothers were talking about bilingualism in similar ways, but wherever a difference presented itself, it felt rather significant. And so during that time, I started to ask myself questions like, is language about input or output, right? Is bilingualism or multilingualism then determined by the speaker or by the listener? And what about in cases where there is no speaker or listener because there's no speech production? How is that meaning measured or defined? Is nonverbal communication rooted in spoken language systems? So in order to kind of get to that, I first needed to understand how mothers were defining bilingualism in general and for their own children. And so these are kind of 3 emerging ideas that I have that I'm seeing coming out of the data, and 3 emerging understandings that I'm having. And I just think it's important to say that, you know, I'm looking at these conversations that mothers are having, and I'm reading the words that they're sharing with me, and I'm going to be sharing some of the data here, and I'm not going to have translations for it. And I just think it's important that you know that those are purposeful choices, because this population of parents in particular are often left out of conversations in education. They're left out of conversations in bilingual education because of their kids' disability. People just think about, you know, the special education component, and they're left out of the special education conversations because of the child's language needs, right? And so I'm really centering mothers' voices and ideas here in order to highlight different perspectives, and how school influences home in the same ways that home can influence school. So the first thing that I noticed is that the majority of the mothers identified their children as bilingual based on the premise that comprehension was sufficient. And I'm actually gonna, yeah. And the second thing is that when mothers were asked to define bilingualism, a subsect of the mothers stated that understanding a language is not sufficient, that you needed to be able to talk and write in that language in order to be identified as bilingual or multilingual. And then the third kind of emerging idea is around oral language production, right? And how that's at the center of how mothers qualify their children's bilingualism, not disability, which is interesting because at school, in schools, we see different patterns. So what does this all look like? I want to pause for 1 minute just to check the chat and make sure I'm not going too fast. Robin, can you unmute and just tell me if I'm going too fast or if this is okay?
You're going perfect because we're having some tech issues. So we keep going in and out of the live. So this will be likely a largely recorded presentation. So,
perfect.
Okay, so you're doing great.
Awesome. My stress level just went down so much. Like, I'm so chill now. So this will be great.
Okay, so it's just us, but we'll post it later. But we're streaming to a streaming thing that streams to the other things, and so there's some tech issues. So, but you're good to go. Okay.
Okay, cool. I will give like a little pause if you want to edit this part out from the video. So when I asked, so there were two questions that I was asking moms. And again, right, this will show even the ways that I've internalized language's relationship to oral production. Because when I put together this survey, it never occurred to me, right, that some of these families would answer as nonverbal. Some of these mothers would say that their child was nonverbal. So my first question that I asked was the first question that I'm sharing here was around what languages does your child feel most confident and comfortable communicating in. Overwhelmingly, we had mothers sharing that their children felt comfortable in both languages, right? Showing this like flexible bilingualism, which was really lovely. We saw that 13% of the students preferred to communicate. 54% was in English, right? So overwhelming, which makes sense. It fits with the trends, right? And it will fit with some patterns that you'll see in a minute around placement for these students. 22% or 23% were identified as being fully bilingual, right? And then we've got 13% that were most confident in Spanish. And then I had 10% of the participants who shared that their children were nonverbal. And so part of me feels like if I had originally designed this tool, I probably would have stopped at like, I wouldn't have even thought about, do you consider your child to be bilingual or not? I'm not sure that I would have asked that if I was thinking that I was having a conversation around nonverbal individuals. And I think that really highlights the ways in which we've ingrained oral production as part of communication and language proficiency in particular. So here we saw that, yes, the child is bilingual, but the mother identified that they felt more comfortable in one language or another, regardless of their linguistic practice. 83% of the children in the study were considered to be bilingual by their mothers, right? And so here, what we see, or the emerging understanding that we have, is that for these moms, right, languaging is about understanding. It's not just about oral production. It's about them making sure that they're being heard, right, and that their child can show them that they're hearing them back, right? It's not totally bound to the idea of oral production, as we see in the second chart. So then the next idea was around how do mothers then define bilingualism? And this was asked separately. So how do you define bilingualism? So how mothers define bilingualism is reflective of how their child communicates, right? So here we have, on the left-hand side, we have Isabel, who considers her children bilingual, trilingual even, as they're being exposed to Italian in the home. So for Isabel, bilingualism is speaking, writing, and reading. And she goes on to say, I'm bilingual. I can write Spanish to him. I can speak Spanish to him. I can read, I can read a poem correctly in Spanish. Not everyone can read things in Spanish while spell the words also in Spanish. Not everyone is bilingual. You have to know those three: read it, write it, and speak it for you to be bilingual. I am bilingual, right? So not only is she basing what bilingualism is on what her children does, but also on what she does, right? So she qualifies herself as bilingual. And so because she's capable of these things, and so these are the skills that define a bilingual person. But on the other hand, we see Mariah on the right side, who views bilingualism as more expansive than this, because her child's mode of communication are not rooted in oral production. So she says he doesn't speak, he understands, but I see that he understands in both languages, because if I tell him if he wants water in Spanish, or you tell him in English, he understands. He doesn't answer because I tell you, he's nonverbal, but he understands. So when asked if she considers her son bilingual, she responds yes, because he understands Spanish and English. And additionally, rather than deny a nonverbal child their bilingualism, mothers like Pilar and Milagros, they quantify it as less than or incomplete, because according to Milagros, a child who understands but does not speak it can be bilingual for the street, but this kind of bilingual is not acceptable for a job because you have to know how to understand. If you can't speak, how are you going to work? And Pilar goes on to add that without oral production, a component is missing. And if a component is missing, that person cannot defend or advocate for themselves. So it's this qualification that begins to highlight the ways in which ableism is embedded in our conceptualization of bilingualism and languaging, and who can be identified as a user of a language. At the same time, right, for other mothers like Mariah, the disability designation offers flexibility in how language is defined, right? So we have this tension between what a complete bilingual looks like, right? Or what full bilingualism looks like, and then all these other ideas of semilingualism. And we cannot separate the fact that a lot of these ideas of semilingualism and of qualifying bilingualism as partial and incomplete are rooted in the theories and in the research work of white scholars, right? And particularly of white male scholars. So we see that work then being trickled into classrooms, and it's going to create real harm, right? And we see that here in the ways that mothers not only think about their own children, but the ways that they think about other children and other people's linguistic practices. So what was also interesting to me is that given the students' overwhelming placement in special education, I was also really interested to see how, if at all, disability related to bilingualism, as defined by the mothers. And so while the mothers did believe that their children's disability impacted their capacity to be bilingual, most still asserted that their child was a practicing bilingual student, and very few even mentioned disability in relation to bilingualism without being explicitly asked. And while that feels really good to me, it was really disheartening to see that even though 25 children were identified as bilingual by their mothers, only 4 of those students were actually enrolled in bilingual education, right? And 3 of those students were nonverbal students, right? Which really highlights this disconnect then between what we say bilingualism is and then who we actually allow to have access to that. And so in order to understand the relationship between disability labels and bilingual placement, I looked at a subset of 7 students for whom delayed speech was presented as the catalyst for an evaluation and eventual placement in special education. And what I found is that all those students later developed oral language, and yet none had been placed in bilingual programs, even though their home language practices were different than the language practices at school. What this means and what this looks like is mothers are being told to place their kids in monolingual programs, right? Because their kids don't talk and because 2 languages will be too confusing, right? Their kids eventually develop oral language, but never do we reintroduce that home language, right? So we've just completely cut off a cultural and social part, right, of this child on the basis that it was more important that they speak than they actually be exposed to and understand or really be able to fully communicate with their community members in all of the languages that are used there. And so that's something to really be thinking about, because we're seeing speech as the entry point for a lot of these students being evaluated and placed in special education, and yet students are not being allowed to use their full linguistic repertoire, which is important, right? And so that brings us to that third emerging understanding, right? That oral languages privileging in society leads to the devaluation of alternative means of communication. And it really kind of highlights these socially normative boundaries that we placed on language and language use. So what does this all mean for teaching and for research? What it means, bilingualism is viewed, and languaging in general is viewed as being codependent on oral speech, which greatly hinders and reduces the forms of communication available to individuals, especially people with language-based disabilities and disability classifications. So I think that this study is interesting to me because it has a lot of implications, because it's really highlighting things that we haven't been thinking about, at least that I haven't been thinking about, in terms of how language is used and how we categorize language. So educators really need to expand their conceptualization of language and bilingualism from a static definition of you are or are not bilingual, or you do or do not understand, to one that makes use of a continuum in which bilingualism is constantly in development. I think it's also important to note that I do not believe we should attribute classifications like semilingual or any other terms that allude to permanent emergent status to students with disabilities, as they will reify perspectives of people with disabilities as inferior, and deny them, and deny other forms of communication that neurodiverse people use. In regards to research, I think it's important that we start exploring how oral language production relates to perspectives of normalcy that teachers and parents hold. Since oral production was a central metric to mothers' conceptualizations of their children's bilingualism, I also think it would be useful for us to think about parents' perceptions of language, right, and bilingualism, and how those are influences by messages they may be getting during a child's evaluation, during a child's classification and special education service processes. And I think that given the findings that I've had, the emerging findings that I've had around students with speech and language impairment, and and their absence from bilingual programs, I think there's also implications to think about how those classifications and are applied and how instructional placement is related. I think ultimately, as we're thinking about ways of introducing autonomy, particularly to individuals on the autism spectrum, we need to be thinking about how language is a tool with which we grant people or deny people autonomy, and that oral language is not the only way that people can communicate, and we really need to be more expansive about how we allow people to be present. That's pretty much it. I hope that you got something out of this and that you have questions. Thanks.
Hi. So it's it'll be my questions.
Yeah,
and I have so many questions. So you can unscreen share, I think, and then it could just be us.
I'm there. Perfect.
It's just us. I'm fascinated by your research. It's so relevant to so many conversations that I have with like families on TikTok about, the litany of horrible advice they've been given about speech therapy, about motivation and language. Like most of the families that are watching probably are, have been offered kind of the, speech therapy of various different varieties, may or may not had a speech therapist who is either, even open to AAC use. And then on top of it, if you have families who are multilingual, they're getting that kind of advice to, only speak in one language because it's already confused, so if you had any advice to give to like a parent who's facing this kind of system that is telling them things we know are not true about language, right? Mm-hmm. What would you recommend that they do, or do you have like a answer that you use a lot, or how do you recommend they navigate that?
Yeah, I think the thing is, we have to remind educators of children's actual practices, right? Yeah. And we have to remind educators of their actual lived environments and their lived realities. I've been doing research with this population for about 4 or 5 years now, and it's the same conversation over and over again, right? These mothers, these households that are completely functioning in a language other than English, and this one individual who is completely isolated from the rest of the family because no one can communicate with them and they can't communicate with others. And so I think we need to be really clear about those realities, right? Like that may be convenient for school, that will not fit our life, right? Like that's not what that child's environment looks like. And really the goal of education is to help children navigate, right, society and their world. And if we are denying them their actual worlds, right, then we're creating other disservices for students with disabilities.
I mean, absolutely. And I hear a lot too about,
also
speech development.
One more thing, it's like the research also doesn't support these decisions. I think that's the other thing, is that like I have so many conversations around like, but it's just so confusing and so overwhelming. It's like, but this kid has been living in their house and been living in their community for all this time until they came to you, right? Like they found a way to communicate their needs. Otherwise, they would not be sustaining individuals, right? Like, yes, there are complications. Yes, it's difficult. And you kind of have to figure out what are the best ways to communicate for all the members, right? But to just decide that the only way that you can communicate with me is by talking to me, we need to recognize that that is denying people their humanity, right? Not just their autonomy, but their humanity completely. And we have to see it as such, and we have to call it that, right? And I think one thing that parents can do is just really use that kind of language, right? To say like, you are denying my child, right, an opportunity to communicate and exist and interact with other people when you make decisions like this.
And their community, right? Like, and your house, and your, like, it's not, it may work, as you said, it may be fine for school when you're one-on-one, with your speech therapist or whatever. But, we find that is not naturalistic speech anyway, right? Right. So it's that kind of therapy language. I had, an interesting question I've been thinking a lot about is, I see, people advocating a lot to get AAC devices for their kids. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of training or understanding around best practices around, bilingualism and AAC, right? Because they're usually programmed in only one language, right? And, we're still fighting to get kids' devices programmed with a voice that sounds like it could be the child, right? Like, not a speech therapist voice, right? But I was wondering, maybe you could, maybe maybe you don't know, like what is best practice around, kind of translanguaging with AAC? Is it like to have a variety, or?
So the truth is that we don't know, because
they don't study it.
It's not studied, and it's just so difficult. It's difficult enough to get people to understand or even consider access to bilingualism for individuals with disabilities, especially nonverbal individuals. It's even more complicated to talk about things like translanguaging, right? Because you already have people in normative spaces, right, in normative ways of thinking about bilingual education, saying that translanguaging is subpar, right, that it's semilingualism. It's not. So if you have that coming, right, I think the other thing that happens is that we've constructed bilingualism and multilingualism into a superpower, right? And that's been one of the things that I've been writing about for a really long time. And so when we write about it as a superpower, and then we position nonverbal students, right, or students with disabilities as broken, why would we allow these broken people access to this superpower, right? A superpower can only be attained by someone who's already normal and great and amazing, right? Like it's extra. And so we don't view language as a human right? We view language as a commodity, right? It is something that, even the way that mom was like, you need that for a job. So even parents are thinking about their kids, not in terms of how they'll interact with human beings, but what's your earning potential, right? Because that's really how we've turned a lot of these practices. And so if you're considered to not have earning potential, why would I give you more skills?
Yeah.
And so why would we then even do that research?
Yeah. I mean, I feel I'm heartened to know there's people like you out there that are asking those questions, because I mean, I've you know, been in those circumstances where those decisions are being made, and it's always been, it feels so haphazard. Right. So like people, it comes down to like, this person thinks this person thinks this, let's try it like this, but it doesn't, obviously there's not like a great research base when it comes to non-speaking autistic students who are emergent bilinguals and AAC users, which is, a really, it's not a small population when you consider that 40% of autistic kids are non-speaking.
Right.
It's a lot of kids. And if 1 in 50 kids is autistic, that's a lot of kids.
Well, and I forgot to mention it, but 20 of the 30 students featured in that study were, diagnosed as ASD, right? So that's a lot of kids. That's a lot of data to see from one city.
So we have a really good question. People are in now, figured it all out. I'm so proud of us. Somebody said, how do you suggest, we have a Montclair student that said, Julia Willie.
Julia Wiley.
Yeah, Wiley, there we go. Wiley, really? Yeah, I'm so bad at reading names. Said, I took a class with you, Maria, and I'm so glad to hear you speak again.
Hi, Julia.
Julie's in my class. So I think there's a lot of Montclair students here.
So great.
Tag team. And then somebody else said, Maria, how do you suggest collaborating with a speech therapist in these situations? Any best practices for collaboration?
So, yeah, I think, we really need to remember and think about the fact that, speech therapists, the definition of their job and the scope of their job is really broad, right? So even though it talks about speech and we think, again, oral production, right? It's not just about oral production. So I would say that it would be helpful to work with speech therapists in conversation about, this is how this child communicates, right? These are communication breakdowns that we've had. How can you help us navigate those? I was listening to a podcast episode recently on rough translation, which talked about how we spent, the accent elimination field is like $1 billion industry in the world, but it would be so much easier and cheaper just to teach people how to hear better, right? And how to hear different accentuations and different sounds. And I feel like that's part of the work that would be really helpful for speech therapists to do and to collaborate with teachers on. It's how can I, as an educator, what are the cues that I can read, right? And then how can we also teach this student, right, cues that they can communicate to us, right? That then let's find a way to create a middle ground, right, where they have some autonomy in how they communicate, but we also make sure that they're being understood and heard, right? I think it needs to be about, how do we maximize this person's capacity to communicate rather than how do we maximize this person's capacity to speak?
That's such an important distinction, and so important in terms of too, we see AAC devices being withheld and this to motivate, verbal speech, and you lose such valuable time. Right.
Yeah, we need to think about, we would never allow a teacher to put tape over a child's mouth today, right? But taking away somebody's mode of communication is the equivalent of doing that, right?
They press a button too many times and it's annoying and they just take it away. And it's not,
But you couldn't do, with a speaking child, you wouldn't do that, right? And I think that these are the reasons why we need to be thinking about how ableism presents itself, right? Because we believe that those things are acceptable because I'm just taking away your tech. No, you're taking away my means of communication, right? Which is a totally different thing. You're taking away my autonomy because guess what? Me pressing that button that annoys the hell out of you, it's a way for me to do something. That's still a me thing, right? So let's have a conversation about behavior. Let's have a conversation about sounds and about, sharing ecological spaces. Let's not just take away people's communication devices.
Truly, I am a firm advocate about that. It's we talk about it a lot that when a child is learning to speak, they babble, and so pressing the same button 100 times is akin to that. But it's not, we don't tape babies' mouths shut, as you said. But I think this is a really interesting conversation. I'm glad that you're doing the work that you're doing. I think it's so important for this kind of intersection to be more research done in this area, because it's so underserved, as you know. And the intersection of ableism and racism and the way that it impacts language and the way that we talk about language in schools.
And
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just the last thing that I wanted to say is that I want to be really clear and say that I don't think that overwhelmingly the teachers who are doing this kind of work, or the speech therapists or the speech pathologists, intend harm or are being negligent. And that's why I think, just as we're having conversations right now about anti-racist training and around anti-Blackness conversations, we need to have really clear anti-ableist conversations in classrooms and with educators, because these are things that are ingrained in us in ways that we do not know or understand. And even me, somebody who's been working in this field for 15 years, I didn't think about nonverbal students, right? I didn't think about them when I was thinking about who is bilingual. And I think we need to be able to understand that there's more than one way for us to deny students their rights and their humanity.
Absolutely. I think that's a great final point for everyone to consider. And I know you've got babies at home, sick babies that need you. So I'm going to end it here. And thank you so much, Maria, for kicking us off and being such a, flexible and gracious collaborator. So we're so happy to have you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And